All right, let's open our Bibles this morning to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11. One of the most difficult, I think, experiences that you can experience in relationships is when either you are misrepresented by others or people begin to misrepresent what you have said. For Paul, who was falsely accused, his integrity brought into question, unfairly attacked, this was a problem for his ministry and for his relationship with this church in Corinth. False accusations have the potential to immediately ruin trust. They will certainly separate friends, and for someone like Paul, they could really undermine and devastate a work that he had come to do. When people slander you, as they had Paul, it is awful hard to correct something that has gone out of someone else's mouth or to retrieve it once it has been spoken. After all, the people that are saying those things are not interested in the truth. They're not motivated by love or by virtue or by a desire to be righteous. Slander is usually propelled forward by hatred or by envy, sometimes by jealousy or self-promotion. But whoever these purveyors of falsehoods are, they are not interested in the unity of the saints or the blessings of the church or the glory of God or even to help the person they're speaking about. They just want to destroy. Some time ago on a Sunday morning, we were going through the Psalms, and we stopped at Psalm 64. I don't know if you remember. But Psalm 64 is a psalm that deals specifically with backbiters and whisperers and slanderers. The Lord described them there as those who are, bent on secret plots of wickedness, to shoot with their tongues like arrows, to bow their arrows and shoot them from behind a tree, saying to themselves as they engage in this evil manner, who's going to see us anyway? We're perfectly covered, and this is a shrewd scheme. And the Lord said he'll shoot back at them with his arrow what won't miss, and promises to protect those to whom, these poisonous verbal assaults would go. It's nothing new in the church. It is certainly nothing new in the world. If you've ever read anything about church history, guys like Luther and Spurgeon suffered greatly at the hands of the church. Paul certainly was in that position as well. And so to a church that he had given his life to and seen planted, that he now finds himself 5 years later after he left, after being there 18 months, hundreds of miles away, the false teachers who had inhabited the church were not just interested in turning the church's heart away from Jesus, which they wanted to do, but in order to do that, they had to turn their hearts away from Paul, who had been a godly example, who had taught them and led them to Christ and had shared with them, as Acts says, Acts 18, verse 12. He'd been there for 18 months just sharing the gospel. And yet, because of these men that now wanted to seek power, they went after Paul at Paul's expense. And the problem is they almost succeeded. A lot of folks in the church's hearts had been and heads had been turned. They had begun to question Paul's love for them. They had begun to entertain doubts about his sincerity. And even when things got better, which is when this letter was written, things had turned for the better, as Paul would be told in the next couple of chapters. Doubt still lingered about his goodness. And so there was still a conflict. Paul vigorously defends himself in this letter very openly and honestly. He's not so interested in his own reputation, although no doubt that was important to him. But he is, intrinsically linked with the message that he was preaching. So any doubt upon him or any shadow that falls on him falls on the gospel. And that Paul just couldn't take. He discredit him, and the message of salvation gets discredited as well. From what you gather as you read this chapter, or this book, I should say, one of the maybe chief accusations against Paul is that his love for them wasn't genuine. that he was not so concerned. He was manipulative and abusive and dictatorial. And Paul goes out of his way to say just the opposite. Besides how he had lived with them, he said in chapter 2, verse 4, I'm just writing to tell you how much we love you. He said it in chapter 11, verse 11, when we got there to care for you, we never were a burden to anyone. We didn't ask anything of you. We just came to serve. And then he said in verse 11, is that because we don't love you? No, just the opposite, because we do. He wrote in chapter 12, same book, I would gladly be spent by you and your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less you seem to love us. So Paul was in a dilemma in many ways. He very much wanted to renew the relationship with the church. And with everything that we've read, now he goes to this. You remember how much I love you and how I showed you God's love. And his response to the criticism and the hurtful things and the misrepresentation was not, as we might suspect we'd find maybe in our own lives, of lashing back. Paul has decided he's just going to love these folks in every situation, which made it very distinct, right? By this love, all men would know that you're my disciples. And you find that in Paul in his response to this church, which he cared for greatly. He, in these verses, especially this morning, reiterates that love. He had defined it in what we read earlier on today in chapter 13, but he really wants them to think about how he was amongst them, because the distinction of the false teachers was they had a nice exterior, but they could have cared less about the people. And Paul thought that should eventually shine through. So here's what I'd like to do with you this morning. I'd like to look with you at 3 verses in chapter 6, verses 11, 12, and 13, which is right where we stopped in verse 10 last week. But then I want to skip from verse 14 through verse 2 of chapter 7 and come back to that next week. But we will take verse 2, 3, and 4 of chapter 7 today. So 6 verses, 3 at the beginning and 3 at the end of this section. In the middle, Paul will talk about the fact that we belong to a different kingdom and that our relationship in the world should not be that loving as it should be in the church. So he'll drive home the point. But I wanted to look at his appeal because he gives to us some things to think about, how God's love is so different than the world's and how he reacts to what had to have been a tremendously hurtful time is a pretty good example to us of how we can handle, dealing with others that we don't get along with, a fractured relationship, the world, and certainly our enemies. Well, let's read the verses we're going to look at this morning. Verse 11 says this, "O Corinthians, we have spoken openly to you. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted by your own affections. Now, in return for the same, and I speak as to children, you also be open." And then he says in verse 2 of chapter 7, "So open your hearts to us. We've wronged no one, corrupted no one, have cheated no one. I do not say this to condemn you, but that as I've said before, that you are in our hearts, to die together and to live together. So great is my boldness of speech towards you, and great is my boasting on your behalf. I'm filled with comfort and exceedingly joyful in all of our tribulations." Paul starts by saying in verse 11, love is honest. I've spoken to you openly. My heart is wide open. The word openly is just the word you would suspect it to be, candidly or forthrightly. One of the characteristics of God's love is that God doesn't hold anything back from us that's profitable. Paul will say to the Ephesians after having been there for 3 years, "For the last 3 years, I've kept back nothing from you." He was able to walk away from the church and from its leadership and say, "I haven't hidden anything from you." Love demands honesty. And God's love is certainly that of being honest. Jesus said, out of the abundance of your heart, your mouth would speak. Now, if you read through Acts 18, where the planning of this church is, or in these 2 letters that we have of Paul's, you realize fairly quickly that Paul was very honest with the church about God. He talked to them about God's word. He talked to them about God's standards. He was moved by the truth. He would say in chapter 4 of this book, you know that it says, I believed and therefore I've spoken. Well, that's exactly how we write to you. We write to you because we believe what God has said, and we want you to believe it. He will say in a couple of chapters, we can do nothing or say nothing against the truth, but we want to pass along the truth to you. So Paul, in his love for the church, told them the truth. The false teachers usually tell you what you want to hear. They'll lie to you if necessary to get the advantage. Paul was not willing to do that. True love would say that you tell the truth. Paul was very honest with the Corinthians about sin. There is a whole movement today to say to the church, it's very unkind to tell people about sin. But if you read scriptures like Ephesians 4, verse 15, it says that we should speak the truth in love. Right? In other words, you can't separate those two out. If you say to someone who's barreling down the road at 80 miles an hour, hey, slow down, the bridge is out ahead, you might go, that's not very kind. No, that's very kind. You're warning them as to what would destroy them. It didn't say speak the truth in love unkindly, but you should still tell the whole truth. And Paul did. You can't separate truth from love. Paul had in great love for the church, presented the gospel. It had bore much fruit, but he also talked to them about the realities of sin. In fact, at the end of this book, in chapter 13, he will say to the Corinthians, I want to challenge you to see if you're really in the faith. Question yourself. Are you really faithful to Christ? But he starts by saying, my heart's open. My heart is open. He will say in chapter 7, verse 3, you've been in our hearts all along. And Paul appeals to his example of love for the church in the way that he presents the truth as an argument that he did love them. And they should know that by how he had treated them. Love is honest. Second of all, in verse 12, he said, look, we're not restricting you. You're restricting us by your own affections. Or if you will, I'm willing to be in fellowship with you. Love is available. And interestingly enough, the word restricted or restrain means to constrict a path or to make a passageway narrow. It would literally say that Paul said, look, it's not my fault that we have no fellowship together. You, by your own affections, have squeezed me out of your life. The door's open for me. It's just not open on your side of the fence. Love has a way of being available, right? Love endures all things. It believes all things. Doesn't fail. We read that this morning. And their rejection of Paul, which hurt Paul greatly, was not found to have a reaction on his side that said, yeah, well, then I don't want to have anything to do with you either. Nope, that's your last chance. He didn't just cut them off in his anger. He kept the door open in his prayerfulness and in his hope. They had rejected him. Paul indeed had spoken about error and sin. Love would do that. But he never stopped carrying them in his heart and in his mind, totally available to renew fellowship. He wanted to just still be a friend to people that weren't very friendly. That's God's love. Only the Lord could do that thing in his heart, and he had. But it's an example to us. Not only is love honest, but it should be available to see restoration. Thirdly, verse 13, Paul said, in return for the same, be open to us. And now he said, I'm speaking to you as like kids. And then he continues in verse 2 of chapter 7, open your heart to us. We haven't wronged no one, corrupted no one, we've cheated no one. Open your heart to us as we've opened our hearts to you. Unrequited love is the worst, because love demands a response. God loves man. His greatest heart hurt is when man doesn't respond to his love. He wants you to. He's done all he can to make the way clear, but not everyone does. Well, Paul hurt over the fact that he had loved this church with an open heart. He had told them everything he knew. He'd been honest and upright, but they hadn't responded. Or if they had responded, they had just responded kind of negatively. And that wasn't good either. So they were embracing the lies of their detractors. And notice he pleads with them. I'm speaking to you like I could speak to kids. Come on, treat us like we've treated you. Why would you do evil for good. It's a sad bunch of verses to me. Paul, the great apostle who gave his life for the sake of planting these churches, who had loved the church there in the midst of this very difficult and dark city, consistently and permanently and sacrificially, but they weren't returning the favor, if you will. Paul knew that as long as their evil associations with the world continued, that he couldn't have much fellowship with them. I understood that. And I think that's why you get to verse 14, and he spends this little time in between just convincing them that they don't belong in the world or have a relationship with them in the world. God's called them out. But he repeats in verse 13 and then in chapter 7, verse 2, make room for us in your heart. We've made room for you in ours, but somehow they had decided otherwise. But he says there's no reason for you not to love us, because love seeks fellowship. When you get saved, the first thing that you'll find is God begins to work his love out in your heart. You want to hang around with people. You might have always decided to just serve yourself, but now it matters what other people think. And that's divine, right? Nobody does that on their own. God gives you that concern. And church becomes an active part of that. Fellowship becomes necessary. You need to love and be loved and serve and be served. Love wants a response. And Paul says that. Come on. Treat us like we've treated you. What have we done? In fact, he says in verse 2 of chapter 7, we haven't wronged anyone, corrupted anyone. We haven't cheated anyone. Love is pure. God's love is pure. Despite all of the false charges leveled against him, Paul said, I haven't wronged anyone. The word wronged is a word that means injured. I think you can understand that. When people go after you, the natural response is you go after them. What did he say about me? Well, that guy's an idiot. I never cared what he thought. Well, you shouldn't listen to him. Paul didn't do that. His response to slander and false accusation was to defend himself, tell the truth, but love the people. If he was tempted to lash out, he didn't do it. He said, I haven't wronged anyone. That's the word he uses here. And I haven't corrupted anyone. The word corrupt means to lead down an immoral path or to stumble someone or to set a terrible example for them. He hadn't done that either. Paul had only had their best interest in mind because love is pure. And notice that he says here at the end of verse 2, haven't cheated anyone either. The word means to take advantage of someone. Or to make a gain from. Certainly one of the things that true love does is it seeks the benefit of others, not itself. Paul was not in a ministry there for gain. He wanted to serve the Lord and serve God's people. And these false accusations that Paul was just in it for himself, they really couldn't stick to his example because that hadn't been the case. Talk is cheap, but his life had showed it. There's no reason for you not to love us. We haven't repaid evil for evil. We haven't set a bad example or led anyone astray. We haven't tried to take advantage of you. God's love set on display in Paul's heart. It's a great thing to be able to say to someone when they have taken now the wrong side about you and who you are, to be able to point to how you've been. And Paul was able to do that. When Moses was chosen by the Lord to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt, when they got in the middle of the desert, and it had been a while, Numbers 16, there was a whole faction of people that began to have meetings about Moses and his leadership and decision-making, and they decided that maybe he needed to be replaced. 3 guys in particular, Korah and Dathan and Abiram, took the lead, but there were 250 others who joined the group. Their words, according to Numbers 16, was to say to Moses, I thought we were going to end up finding ourselves in a place where there was milk and honey and all, in a land that was flowing. Instead, you've brought us out to the wilderness to kill us. Who made you king anyway? Well, actually what they said was, why do you act like a prince over us? And if we don't join you anymore, are you going to put our eyes out? We're tired of you. We don't want nothing to do with you anymore. Moses was mad. He was a smart mad. He went to the Lord with mad. He said to the Lord, don't accept their sacrifices, Lord, and don't listen to their words, and disrespect their offering. because I have not taken one donkey from them. I've not gone out of my way to herd them anytime. I've always set a good example for them. He goes over the same list. And the Lord said, bring them together in the morning and I'll deal with it. Now, I haven't got time to tell you the whole story, but he dealt with it. And let's just say these 253 men who decided to rebel against Moses' authority would only last for a day or so. But Moses was able to defend himself by saying, here's the life that I've lived. When Samuel was asked by the people to get him a king, and it broke Samuel's heart because he knew the Lord wanted to be the king. Now, you can learn from the Bible that God had a king in mind, an earthly king, a kingdom upon the earth. He had someone in mind, but not Saul. But when Samuel, when he was old and the Lord told him to, give the people what they wanted and all, and he would take care of it, Samuel got together with the folks, and in 1 Samuel chapter 12, he gave his farewell address. And he was still kind of hurting over all that they had wanted and beyond what Samuel had given them. And so here's what Samuel said, today, since we're all here, could you witness against me which ox or whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Who have I cheated or oppressed or bribed? If you can come up with anything, I'll restore it to you today. I haven't cheated and oppressed any of you. I haven't taken anything from any man's hand. And they said, you have. And he said, all right, that's the way I want to go out. And Paul says the same thing here. His honesty in ministry, his forthrightness in dealing with these folks, they have no reason to come and hate him and believe some of these lies about him. That hadn't been his life. When Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, a couple of chapters ahead, he will say to them, when I was with you, I had no need. When I was a burden to you, I relied upon the saints in Macedonia, hundreds of miles to the north, to provide. I kept myself otherwise from me at all. I don't want to be a burden to any of you. And that's how Paul served. We always used to hear at the pastors' conferences when Chuck was around, he would always say, be careful that you ever serve the body for your own benefit, because you're not there to do that. You're there to feed the flock and to give your life for the sake of the saints. Don't do it for yourself. And there's always those warnings, isn't there? Ezekiel said there's shepherds that feed themselves. They make deals. They go after people that can do them some good. They use them for their own benefit. The Lord said that he would deal with them. Paul, like I said to the Ephesian elders, I am innocent of your blood. I've never coveted somebody's silver. I've never gone after somebody's apparel. You know that my own hands have provided not only for me, but for all those who are with me, so that I could always set before you an example that Jesus said it's better to give than to receive. And by the way, that's the only quote of Jesus that we don't find in the Gospels. It's in the book of Acts. It's given to us by Paul about the way that we serve one another, that love is selfless. That love is selfless. It doesn't seek to serve itself. So Paul appealed to them. I haven't cheated anyone. When Nehemiah became the governor in Judea in chapter 5 of Nehemiah, he said, everyone that was before me used to always lay big, heavy burdens upon the people. They would take their bread, would take their wine, would exact a tax upon them that was difficult. Many, I think he said 40 shekels of silver at the time. Even let the rulers who served the other rulers to lord over the people. He said, I couldn't do that. I feared the Lord. And he makes the case that, you should do it right. And then he even said, Lord, you remember me for good. In this book, chapter 12, Paul will write to them, did I ever take advantage of you? Or did anyone I send to you ever take advantage of you? When I had Titus come to see you, he will write, or his brother that came with him, did they take advantage of you? Or did they not walk in the same spirit and in the same steps that I did? In other words, Paul's whole team was not allowed to go out and try to serve themselves. So Paul had a very strong basis from which to call these Corinthians, but it was his life of love that caused him to be able to say that, could you love us back that way? with that kind of selflessness. Not that I've written to condemn you, and by the word condemn here is the word for final judgment. It is only found here and in chapter 3 where Paul writes about the law that condemns. Paul was saying, look, I'm not trying to point out your faults or somehow pass judgment as if I'm better than you are, because love doesn't keep records of wrongs, and it covers a multitude of sin. But I want you to remember that you're in our hearts. I've told you that time and again. We're for you. We're with you. We'll die together and we'll live together. Love forgives. I want to remind you how I've always loved you. In fact, notice this expression at the end. And by the way, the colloquial in the first century, at least in Greek literature, was the words, we'll live together and die together. It meant we'll be friends forever. And Paul takes a very popular phrase and he reverses it to say, we'll die together and we'll live together. Christian perspective, right? We're going to go on beyond this life to the next. It's kind of like what Ruth said to her mother-in-law, Naomi, when she said, you know, your God will be my God, and where you die, I'll die. We're going to stick this thing out. So Paul, love forgives. It's selfless. It's available. It's honest. It seeks fellowship. And then we read in verse 4 the most remarkable things. He said, great is my boldness of speech towards you, but great also is my boasting on your behalf, which has filled me with a constant, literally the way the wording is, comfort, and allows me to be exceedingly joyful in all of our tribulations. Paul was very bold in his speech to them because he loved them. It drove him to speak, right? And he says, and great is my boasting on your behalf, which to me is a remarkable thing to hear. If you've been with us and you know a little bit now about the Corinthian relationship and what was going on, you know, for Paul to say, everywhere I go, I really boast about you, almost sounds ridiculous, right? It borders on the shocking. The Corinthian church had the greatest amount of problems of any new church or any New Testament church, at least the ones we have records of. There was no worse place to be than them. They were constantly stumbling and falling. And now lately, they've been overrun by false teachers who had caused havoc and interrupted fellowship and broke the people's relationship with God and turned on Paul, their founder. And Paul says, everywhere I go, I brag about you. How in the world is that possible? You read this and you want to say to yourself, well, certainly he's not bragging about the recent past history, which might invite scrutiny rather than trust. But that's not what it is at all. I think that Paul truly believed and hoped in love all things, and that Paul was reluctant to believe anything other than God had begun a good work here, and God was going to complete it. It didn't look good now, but God wasn't finished yet. And so his reaction to their hatefulness and their being caught up in the slander and all was not to lash out, but in love to see things through God's eyes. You know, true love's not naive, but it does have spiritual eyes. This is not the myth of, positive thoughts make good things happen, but rather believing God for the best allows you to act differently than the people who are in the world. And so Paul doesn't respond to their vitriol, he responds to what he knows God is doing. And despite their unfaithfulness and their disloyalty and their sin, while people behind Paul's back were criticizing him, to their face he was openly loving them wherever he went. He talked about God has worked there. The church has been planted there. The community is being impacted. People are getting saved. There's growth, and the gospel is being spread. Paul viewed this in light of love. Isn't that the way we should be looking at things when people disappoint us or when they hurt us or when we're taken up? Well, the Lord's not done yet. Rather than taking everything so personal and lashing out, no, walk in God's love. Walk in God's love, which is open and available and seeks fellowship and is pure and selfless and forgives and believes all things. He bragged about them to others. And then he says the most remarkable thing at the end of verse 4. He said, I'm filled with comfort. and exceedingly happy. You can't just be joyful, exceedingly joyful in all of our tribulation. Maybe even more surprising than his trust and praise for the Corinthians was that somehow they still brought him joy. You would think that the thought of the Corinthians at this point would have soured his stomach. Oh, those guys. I thought we'd done a good work there. They're so ungrateful. Despite all of the problems, Paul uses a perfect passive indicative verb. I know it means nothing, nor should it. But it does in Greek mean that it is a lasting work. In other words, Paul said, you have always been my joy, and you have always comforted me, and you still do to this day. That's literally the way it reads. You've been a comfort to me, and even now in the worst of times, you're still a comfort to me. And you're still the reason I have abounding joy. Exceeding joy is a compound word that literally means super happy or super joyful. Really? It's not enough to just say you're joyful. These guys actually made you really joyful? Yep, because I know that God isn't finished. And so I'm sticking with that. Love has eyes that are different than the world. Now, what if we all dealt with each other that way? When we're hurt by folks or undermined or slandered or maybe in the world, because the only thing that the world oftentimes sees is not our words, but our love, the love of God in our hearts. By it all men should know. So Paul's expression of love to the saints here in Corinth is a pretty accurate reflection of God's love for each of us. He tells us the truth. He's grieved when we sin. It disrupts our fellowship with, the door's open on his eye and it's just shut on ours so often. He's eternally loyal. He's going to finish what he began. And he rejoices over us. Can you imagine the Lord looking at you and rejoicing? Oh, I'm glad I got him. Really? You must be the only one, Lord. Well, it may be, but he is the one. Rejoicing and knowing that he's going to finish in you the work that begins. God's love makes you different. It's the only thing that does. Next week in verses 14, down through chapter 7, verse 1, we're going to look at an entirely different world that you and I live in now as Christians and how the Lord would encourage us to make the comparison. Are we going to live like the world, respond like the world? Is the world just going to see a bunch of religious people who respond like they do? Or are we going to be the reflection of God's love in a world that doesn't know anything about it? Amen? Father, we're so thankful this morning that you love us so. And even as we've just read through these verses, how convicting, Lord, sometimes they can be, that we would find ourselves responding not like a godly man or woman, but like the world does. We hate those who hate us. We love those who love us. We talk behind the backs of those who we don't care for. We make our case to defend ourselves. And then we read about Paul's reaction to a whole church and the disruption that had come. And he said, open your heart. I'm open in mind to you. I've always been honest and loving and selfless, and the door's always been open. And when we're proud of what God has done, and we boast about the work of the Lord in your life, and you're a cause of great joy, even though they were at this time, many of them enemies. Paul looked beyond the immediate to the bigger vision, to the greater good. And may you help us to do that. Love believes all things. May that be true of us. May we, in love, endure all things and bear all things and not fail, not allow the enemy to get a foothold, to bring destruction or division. No wonder we read there in the Proverbs that you hate those that sow division amongst the brethren, because it's not the work of God to sow division. You came to heal and to bless and to support and strengthen. May we be the same example that Paul seems to have been in this church. May we be able to say with Paul, we've defrauded no one, we've hurt no one, cheated no one, corrupted no one, injured no one, wronged no one, and just to love those whom you put in our path, so that by that love the world can see the difference. This is a child of God. This person knows God. And we can be that witness that you'd have us to be. May you fill us with your love. May you reduce us this morning to the love of God. And may it all be about you and your glory. Maybe you're in church this morning and you're pretty angry at someone. Maybe you're carrying a lot of bitterness around. It really isn't a work of God's Spirit. We can point our finger at the flesh, the world, the devil. Much better source of bitterness than the person you're angry with. Paul was hurt. Paul was set aside. Paul was underappreciated. Paul was mistreated unfairly. And here's his response. You read it this morning for yourself. Because that's how the love of God responds. And may you have that love as well. Maybe you just leave your bitterness with God and look beyond to what God is doing and dying to yourself. You walk in his love. You become that example. It's going to be amazing what he'll do through your life. So give it to him this morning and go home free of it. Shall we stand?